where you live, and it depends what gender you are, but basically we're talking about literacy rates of about 60%, between 50 and 60% in the middle of the century. The big breakthrough in terms of literacy rates is the introduction of compulsory elementary education that begins in 1870. And that's designed precisely, this is a big move to get the state involved in education, which had traditionally been the church's thing. That was made possible by precisely that argument, that you can't leave people to be illiterate and not to be engaged, not be able to be engaged in these types of self-improvement. Things like the temperance movement were very, very good at providing events where literacy was not required. Okay, so for instance, they used to frequently, when there was a big festival day, a big fair day, where everybody goes out and drinks all day, and then there's always violence at the end of the day. I was in the UK 2 years ago at the end of one of these days up in Derbyshire, where it's a big race day, and everyone had been drinking all day. And I went out to this pub with my friend, and we saw 3 fights in the pub. This is a tiny little village, probably about as many people in this room. 3 fights in the space of an hour, 2 girl on girl. It was just like, I've come home. Sorry, I'm digressing. So the temperance movement are very good in those conditions, in those situations, of putting on what were called counter-attractive events. Events that would be an alternative to those where you would have to go drinking. And so they would put on a tea party, for instance, or some type of performance where, illiteracy was not a bar to participate in. Okay. What am I talking about now? Oh yes, we're talking about the commercialization of leisure, and I'm going to talk to you about this in 2 headings, about new times and new spaces provided for the pursuit of leisure. So, new times first. In the old customary culture, the working week was a somewhat chaotic and disorganized affair. Time was regulated, as I've said before, by daylight hours, by church bells. When textile mills came in, early things, they used to have knocker-uppers, people that used to walk down the terrace streets, knocking on people's windows with a stick to wake them up. And then, of course, you have the imposition of all the regular routines of working life, the introduction of whistles in factories, bells, hooters, all of that type of stuff. But that is a really late 19th century development, okay? And up until that really doesn't work. And most people worked from Tuesday through Saturday, okay? And then they had Sunday and Monday completely off. Monday was known as Saint Monday, the day that was totally yours, because Sunday, of course, you were meant to be doing religious stuff. Okay? Now, increasingly, what you have is that the reform of the working week into a settled pattern. So by the 1870s, a whole series of factory acts and something called a Bank Holiday Act that came out in 1871 established the 5.5 day working week that we're now familiar with. Went from Monday to Saturday lunchtime, okay? And then uniform national holidays that were true across the country, okay? And this was a way of organizing production across the country as a whole. So Saturday afternoon in the new regime became the afternoon where you went shopping. You would always go to the markets on a Saturday afternoon. The poorer you were, the later that you went, so you could pick up the stuff that the market stores couldn't sell. And Saturday afternoon for men was one where you went to the pub and you went and watched or played sport. Sunday then became the day of rest and the day for family life, and of course for some church attendance. Nonetheless, Saint Monday continues to exist in certain localities even beyond this reform of the working week. So in Sheffield, for instance, and Sheffield steel mills and workshops continue to conform to the tradition of St Monday almost down to the end of the 19th century. The other great example of the lack of standardization, even though standardization was introduced, was this phenomenon known as Wakes Weeks, okay, which basically started out as a religious holiday, and a religious holiday that different communities experienced at different times, sort of around May time, okay. And what happens was that in the textile mills in the northwest, communities used to stagger their wakes weeks. Okay, so that the mills would close down for an entire week, and the whole town would be on holiday, and many of them would go off to a seaside resort, often paid for. I mean, the transportation paid for by the mill owner. And one reason for staggering wakes weeks was that not everybody could go to these seaside resorts at the same time because there wasn't enough of them. Okay. Another reason was, of course, you could be in production while other people were on rest. And that tradition carries on very late into the 20th century. I used to have a baker in a town, that little town that I lived in the northwest, who still closed down for wakes weeks every year, even in the 1990s. I bet that's not happening anymore, but it was the last example I knew of that. Now, the other key thing that you need to know in this new division of time is that there's a clear demarcation of a time for work and a time for leisure. Okay, and that leisure was about increasingly resting and recuperating to be ready for more work. Okay, it was about improving yourself, but basically getting ready for the next working week. A completely different concept to the old customary culture where work and leisure were frequently part of the same continuum. So let me give you some examples of the new types of spaces of leisure that emerge in this new commercialized and standardized popular culture. I have to do this just because I did that lecture on the Great Exhibition. So this is the Great Crystal Palace that had been constructed in Hyde Park for 1851. 1854, it gets moved to Sydenham in Kent. I don't know what distance that is, about 50 miles maybe. But remarkable. The whole building is basically taken down and reconstructed somewhere else. And even more remarkably, it gets turned into a pleasure park. Okay, so this great, palace for the display of the advantages of free trade ends up as a pleasure park where there was a natural history museum, an aquarium, musical concerts, botanical gardens. Okay, now all of those things straight out of the canon of rational recreation. Go to look at plants, go to look at creatures, go to listen to good music. That's all great. But then, because that type of stuff wasn't like super popular, people weren't going to rush to go to Sydenham to the aquarium or the botanical gardens. Then they also had to put on the stuff that people actually wanted to see, like great fireworks displays, fairground rides, the odd freak show, that always pulls in the punters, people reading palms, traveling circuses and so forth. Now I could talk to you about a whole range of different types of new spaces that occur up. I've already mentioned to you the construction of Regent Street and department stores. That's another great example of commercialization. What I'm going to do now is dwell simply on the case of the music hall. Okay? Now, music halls emerged basically from pub entertainment. Okay? Most pubs, many pubs, used to have one room where there was a piano. It was called a free and easy. You could go in, sit down, play on the piano and have a sing-along. Okay? there was obviously no, you went to drink and there was no admission charge. Music halls develop out of that. They commercialize that type of entertainment. They separate out entertainment from simply going for a drink. So you can see this is an image of a music hall in the 1860s, which basically comes out of a pub. And increasingly, this is an image from the 1890s of a purpose-built music hall, which I'm going to explain to you in a moment. By 1870, there are 31 big purpose-built halls in London and 384 around the rest of the country. And the period from 1880 down to the First World War is really the golden age of the music hall. Okay, number of things happen. Okay, first is that they get built and bought up by a very specific set of owners. So this is the first time that you have the concentration of ownership in entertainment, the provision of mass entertainment across cities. So, for instance, a big music hall chain was known as Stoll and Thornton. And they own chains, around the country. The Moss chain was very big in London. Concentration of ownership meant that you could build these purpose-built halls and increase the capacity of punters that would come in to the shows, and you could put on larger programs. Okay? Now, music hall are basically what you and I would know as a variety program. You would have a lot of musical comedy like you saw at the beginning of the lecture. You would have straightforward comedians. You would have jugglers. You'd have a whole range of different things going on. And with that came, with the new concentration of ownership and the larger programs, came the development of a star system, where particular owners would cultivate a particular performer and then rotate them around their music halls. Finally, the other point that I want to highlight to you is the increasing regulation of the audience. First part of that regulation of the audience is the banning of alcohol from music halls, in London anyway. The London County Council, after it's formed in 1888, has a whole series of attempts to get alcohol out of music halls, and the music hall owners have a series of battles with them. By 1909, only 8 out of 29 of one chain had a liquor license in them, and the ones that did have a liquor license were generally the smaller ones. I put up here a series of images of music halls at different moments, so you can see some sense of how the dynamics of the audience changes over time. Okay, so the 1860s, when you have the sort of first, stylized out of a pub, you can see that basically what's happening on the stage is not the primary focus of the people in the around the tables. The tables are facing, they're basically drinking. By the 1870s, when you have the big purpose-built halls coming in, you can see that now pretty much a similar thing is going on, but you're beginning to have seating, which of course varies in price and is structured increasingly to the audience. Okay? Now you know this because you've all gone into cinemas that have been built in that sort of Art Deco way from the 1920s that were very much styled on these types of things. And eventually, you end up, as we are in movie, in what they called here, movie halls, movie theatres. Thank you. Where we're all basically facing the front, and the